Hello, it's reproductive system time, and I'm not going to be making as many videos for this unit, but I do want to make a few, and this one has some things that I find personally interesting and relevant that I do want to address. So let's get started on the anatomy of the reproductive system. So here, first, what I want to talk about, sex, not gender. That's what we're talking about in class. So sex is based on biology. That's your chromosomes, but also your hormones, your genes, the sex organs, and your secondary sexual characteristics. So that means what happens when you hit puberty, okay, how you outwardly appear, your secondary sexual characteristics. So it's important to know that sex is not binary. Sex isn't literally just XX and XY. There are many other options. There's triple X, there's single X, there's XYY, there's XXY. There's more. That's just a sampling. Also, a lot of the development of sexual characteristics in utero have to do with the SRY gene getting turned on. And in crossing over, typically the SRY gene is located on the Y chromosome, but there are instances where it is found on the X chromosome or it can be missing from the Y chromosome. Okay, so people who are XX who supposedly should be female can develop male assigned at birth anatomy. So it'd be often XX without the SRY gene. And people with XY can develop female assigned at birth anatomy. And oftentimes that is the XY genetics, but missing the SRY gene. There are also people who are intersex and lots of variations in there. Gender, on the other hand, which we're not really talking about when we're talking about the anatomy of the reproductive system, is how we think about our identity. And it as well is a spectrum. So neither are binary. So again, we're going to focus on female assigned at birth and male assigned at birth for the purposes of this reproductive anatomy lesson. Here are just some examples of intersex genitals. So you can see they're not all the same. There are variations, but in all of them, there will be some typically female assigned at birth anatomy and some typically male assigned at birth anatomy combination. So the reproductive anatomy for females assigned at birth include the vulva. That's the part on the outside of the body. So when we're referring to the genital area, we're referring to the vulva. The uterus, called the womb. That is where a fetus will grow. It is a very muscular organ. It has to work very hard in contractions during childbirth. It is also where menstrual blood will come from. And that lining will be shed. Ovaries, storage unit for eggs. It produces hormones, primarily estrogen and progesterone, but also testosterone. And it controls things like periods, your eggs developing, as well as pregnancy. And fallopian tube, you have two on each side. They're narrow tubes, and they're going to they have these little things on the end like this. They're going to snatch the egg and allow it to pass along the fallopian tube, sweeping it along toward the uterus. And fertilization, if a sperm reaches an egg in the fallopian tube, it can be fertilized. And then the cervix, remember cervical means neck, so the cervix is the neck of the uterus, okay? And most of the time it is tightly closed. It keeps things from being able to enter the uterus, but during childbirth it will dilate or open. During ovulation, the cervix opens slightly. Also, the mucus found there changes consistency to kind of help sperm along on their way. And then the vagina is muscular, and it allows the birth of a baby to happen. Also, it's where menstrual blood leaves the body, passes through the uterus. Something that I just find fascinating that I want to talk about is the clitoris. So looking at the clitoris from the external anatomy. So it's going to look like the clitoris is just this little tiny thing. What the clitoris is comparable to is the glans or the head of the penis. Okay. But if you look, you could see what that person is holding in their hand. That is literally the size of the clitoris. That little glans piece, which is exposed, is the tiniest fraction of the actual clitoris. And you can see it goes around the side of the labia, and it is much larger than most people would even think. And all of the clitoris would have nerves which can be stimulated. But the glands of the clitoris, just like the glands of the penis, has about 6,000 to 8,000 nerve endings. There isn't a lot of research on how many are in the rest of the clitoris. So do you remember which structure stores eggs? Hopefully you do. It's the ovaries. All right, so here you can see the fallopian tubes. You can see their little projections at the end that are going to kind of sweep the egg when it is released from the ovary. You can see the uterus, you can see the cervix, remember the neck of the uterus, and you can see the vagina. All right, so now we'll talk about male assigned at birth, and let's talk about the reproductive anatomy. So the penis, that is the external organ. It's the main organ of the male assigned at birth, reproductive anatomy. And in addition to having a sexual function, it allows for urine to leave the body. The scrotum, that is the sac. Okay, it is the skin that hangs below the penis and holds the testicles and keeps them at the right temperature. So if the body temperature is dropping, so if you're cold, the testicles are going to be brought up, so this and closer to the body, closer to the inside. If you're warm, the scrotum will hang lower, okay, to kind of cool them down, because sperm have a very narrow temperature range for them to be viable. So if the testicles were actually inside the body at 98.6 degrees, that would not allow for sperm growth and development. So that is why the testicles are actually outside of the body. So the testes or testicles, they kind of look like balls, and that's kind of what they're called, the balls, but they're inside the scrotum, and they do produce sperm and hormones like testosterone, which is the major hormone, but also estrogen. The prostate gland, that produces a fluid that helps sperm move. This is checked by the doctor in males as they get older, because prostate cancer is fairly common, and there are issues that can be picked up, and it's tested by inserting a finger into the rectum, and usually we'll have to turn and cough in order to check that it is not enlarged. We have the vas deferens that goes from the epididymis. So what's the epididymis? That's the sperm storage. So you can see the epididymis is literally sitting on top of the testicle. And that's where sperm are stored and growing and getting ready and mature. Okay, and then as the body is preparing for ejaculation, the sperm will travel through the vas deferens. Also, that's the tube that's cut in a vasectomy. Okay, well, actually both. So the vasectomy would cut both tubes, both vas deferens. So the sperm are produced in the testicles. They kind of store, grow out, mature in the epididymis, and then prior to ejaculation, they're going to need to go to the vas deferens in that long tube, curl around, and they're going to pick up at the seminal vesicle and at the prostate. They're going to pick up fluid, and that's to enable the sperm to survive inside the vagina, uterus, and fallopian tube on their long journey to try to find an egg. If sperm were not released in semen, that fluid, they wouldn't survive. So the seminal vesicle produces most of that fluid, but some does come from the prostate gland. And then there's the ejaculatory duct that is going to deliver everything into the urethra and allow for ejaculation out the urethra. Okay, but you can see that the urethra is also connected to the bladder, which means that urine can pass out of the body through that as well. Okay, how long can sperm survive? So fun facts, there are about 200 million sperm in each ejaculation. Now, obviously that number varies, so it's not like 100%, all right? Also, the testicles can produce roughly 1,500 sperm a second, so about 500 million a day. That's a lot of sperm, right? So how long can sperm survive? So here's some rough estimates. But what I want to focus on is inside the female body, up to 5 days. The first 48 hours, the first 2 days, sperm are the most viable. So that means if sperm are present in the uterus and in the fallopian tube when an egg is released during ovulation, it is possible for the sperm to fertilize the egg even though sex was had days prior, up to 5 days prior, okay? And also, the egg, which I'll talk about later, has a viability of about 12 to 24 hours. So there's a pretty big range where fertilization can actually happen. Okay, it is important to note that once semen is dry, the sperm are no longer viable and cannot result in a pregnancy. So semen on the skin, as soon as it's dry, no longer viable. On clothing, on sheets, whatever, no longer viable. Once you wash your hands, if you have semen on your skin, on your hand, that will destroy the sperm, okay? So once it dries, the sperm are no longer viable, okay? So again, what does that mean? Although typically ovulation happens at day 14, you can see roughly 5 days before and 5 days after would technically still be fertile, depending when the egg is released. So I might ovulate on day 10, which means during my period, the end of my period, the end of menstruation, it might be 5 days away from ovulation. So I could still potentially get pregnant even though I was still in my period. So important to note that just because you are on your period does not mean that you will not end up being pregnant. So sperm versus egg size. So first, let's look at this. The egg is about 30 times larger. So the egg is the largest cell in the body. It's about 1.5 millimeters. You can literally see it without a microscope. The sperm, smallest cell, 0.05 millimeters, tiny. Also, just a minute about circumcision. Circumcision is removing the foreskin. So that's the skin that covers the head of the penis. The United States is the only developed country to routinely perform this procedure for non-religious reasons. Many cultures perform circumcision for religious reasons. The United States, again, is the only one that does this for non-religious reasons on a broad basis, okay? So removing the foreskin exposes the glands all of the time. So in order to expose the glands for the penis, when you have a foreskin, you would have to slide back the foreskin, okay? So you can see in the surgery, there's like a slit cut and cut around, and there's some sutures, which just requires some cream and care as the infant is recovering. So which structure carries urine and semen outside of the body? Hopefully you remember, that's the urethra. All right, so sexual development. For the first 6 weeks or so, it's 6 to 8 weeks in the womb, reproductive structures look pretty much the same in everyone. There's a major change at the 6 to 8 week fetal development, and that typically means the SRY gene is turned on. If the SRY gene is turned on, then testicles will begin to develop. If the SRY gene is not turned on, ovaries will begin to develop, okay? So you can see initially starts the same. So here is a good image right here. You could see originally at 6 weeks, starting looks exactly identical. Somewhere between the 6 and 8 week mark is when differentiation is going to happen. So male assigned at birth characteristics will develop in the presence of an activated SRY gene, and female assigned at birth characteristics will develop in the absence of that gene being turned on. Okay, but we talked about before, there are lots of glitches in that process. So remember we talked about before, the clitoris, 6,000 to 8,000 nerve endings in the glands of the clitoris, the same number in the head of the penis, which is also called the glans. Now, also, the vagina has a very limited number of nerve endings, and that's really so that childbirth can happen. So it's not as painful. Not that it's not painful, because it is. Puberty. So puberty is the process through which a child's body will mature into an adult body. So it's developing secondary sexual characteristics. It's initiated by the gonadotropin releasing hormone. It usually occurs somewhere between ages 8 and 12. But the important part is that hormone stimulates the pituitary, which is the master gland. And then it's like, makes a whole bunch of things happen. Okay. So testes begin releasing more testosterone and start producing sperm. Ovaries release estrogen and progesterone, and eggs begin to be released. So ovulation begins. But there's lots of other things that happen. It's acne, body hair changes, voice changes, pubic hair, the vulva, penis, breast tissue becomes enlarged. So which gland is stimulated and releases hormones that begin sexual development? Remember the master gland? Pituitary. All right, so now the menstrual cycle. It is roughly 28 days, okay? That does not mean your cycle cannot be shorter or longer, and yours can also be irregular. So it really varies from person to person. So menstruation means the elimination of that lining of the uterus as it thickens and prepares for the implantation of an embryo. No embryo implant, menstruation happens. So the follicular phase is getting ready for ovulation. So what happens in the ovary, there's a bunch of follicles that get stimulated. So a bunch of eggs start to develop. The best one gets released in ovulation. The other ones kind of die off. So it's not just one egg that's get used up in one ovulation. It's probably around 10. And then the luteal phase, that egg actually bursts through, travels through the fallopian tube, remember, okay? But as the egg bursts through, the follicle stays in the ovary and it creates something called the corpus luteum, which releases a hormone that is preparing the lining of the uterus for an egg that has been fertilized to implant. All right, so the egg is able to be fertilized. It's viable during a 12 to 24-hour window once it's released from the ovary. At birth, a person with ovaries will have about 1 to 2 million eggs. By puberty, that might be around 300,000. By age 35, less than 100,000. Menopause will begin when there's no more eggs, usually around age 52. So only 300 to 400 eggs will actually be ovulated in a lifetime, but we probably go through about 10 times more than that because in the process, a whole bunch start to mature and the best one is chosen to be released. So which structure maintains the thickened lining of the uterus but dies if there's no fertilized egg that implants in the uterus? That's the corpus luteum, which you can see here. Here's the egg being released. You can see the follicle, which turns into the corpus luteum, but then it's going to regress and go away if there is no implanted embryo. And there you have it. That's reproductive anatomy. Hopefully you learned a thing or two, and there's so much more I could talk about. So if you have questions, please ask them. I would love to answer them.